Today I'd like to share with you how you can evaluate any chess position or any chess move easily within seconds and do it similar to Magnus Carlsen. Let's take a look. Here's the first example, the game between Magnus Carlsen playing white against Giri playing black. It's white to move, and here's the first question. How would you evaluate a position like this? Who's better and why? Or maybe it is equal. What do you think about this? First of all, it's not that easy to evaluate the position because it's really imbalanced. We can see that the material is imbalanced, the pawn structure is also completely different, and at first you may find yourself a bit confused deciding who's better and why. Maybe you think that, okay, because black has two rooks against white has a rook and a bishop, maybe black is better, or maybe white's better because the black's king is a bit exposed, maybe white can deliver some checks here. But neither of that is correct. So first of all, let me share with you the classical approach, which is like the really step-by-step approach that you can use to evaluate any position easily. And later in this video, I'll give you the pro tip how you can use a simplified version of this classical approach to evaluate any position within seconds. All right? But anyway, first of all, let's start from the classical approach. There are four factors that you got to consider in this case. The first factor is material. If we start counting material for this example, you can see that white has bishop and two pawns against a rook. And it is an about equal material balance. For reference, I'm putting here on the screen the table where you can see the value of pieces, and the bishop is worth approximately 3 pawns, therefore a bishop plus 2 pawns equals a rook, approximately. The second factor is activity, which mainly talks about activity of your and opponent's pieces. And if we evaluate this factor, we can see that white is clearly ahead here. For example, black's both rooks are passive, doing nothing. The knight on a rim is dim, and basically black's all of their pieces are passive. In contrast to this, if you take a look at the white's pieces, the white's rook here on b7 is doing a great job controlling an open file as well as putting pressure on the 7th rank. The knight on h6, even though it's on the edge, but it's in the close proximity to the king, it can deliver some checks, therefore it's pretty active. Currently the bishop on a3 is not doing much, but it's white to move and white can easily push the pawn forward, and the bishop also gets very active along this diagonal. Therefore, comparing activity, we can see that white is clearly ahead, all of his pieces are a lot more active compared to black, clear edge for white. Alright, the third factor is king safety, and even though in an endgame it is a less important factor because normally you cannot checkmate an opponent's king in an endgame, nevertheless we can see that the white's king is completely safe here and the black's king is a bit exposed. Again, white can deliver some checks here and annoy the king, therefore overall white has an advantage here as well. Not such a big advantage, but nevertheless it's an edge for white. And the fourth and the final factor is pawn structure. Here, if we take a look at the pawn structure, that we can see that white has a passed pawn here along the c-file, which is really dangerous. It's fairly close to the promotional square, c8. And if you compare this to the black's pawn structure, you can see that all of the black's pawns are isolated and weak, and white can possibly take aim at any of them. Therefore, talking about the pawn structure, white is clearly ahead once again. Now let's put it all together. Talking about the four factors to evaluate a position, we can see that the material balance is approximately equal, but the rest of the factors are clearly in the white's favor, which shows you that white should have a significant advantage here. Like 3 items out of 4 are in the white's favor. That's a big advantage. And indeed, this position is winning for white. We can quickly see how it ended. White pushed the pawn c6, as well as attacking the rook here from f8. Giri removed the rook. White pushed the pawn forward, black tried doing something, bishop b2, also taking aim at this diagonal of the king, black tried to close it, but now white relocated the knight to d6, therefore he can grab the rook on the next move, and black resigned within a few moves. Therefore, it was easily winning for white indeed. Here's the next example, this time Carlsen's playing black against Esipenko, playing white, also pretty strong grandmaster. What do you think about this position? By the way, it is white to move, but I guess it doesn't really matter that much. Who's better and why? Well, now you're a pro at evaluating positions and you can evaluate it as precisely as Magnus Carlsen, therefore you can give it a shot. And now we can also try doing this together. So the first factor is material balance is equal here. The second factor is activity of your and your opponent's pieces. And here we can see that, well, it's more or less equal. Both players centralize their forces, they're fully developed. The knight is on the edge of the board, but is doing a good job putting pressure onto this pawn, therefore we can't really say that it's a bad piece. It's quite normal. Both players are doing well here, therefore it's about equal. In terms of the pawn structure, we can see that black has these pawns in the center of the board, and even though white is trying to attack them, but they're well protected, and since they're in the center of the board, they're also controlling a wide range of squares, so there are pros and cons having this kind of an isolated pawn in the center. And once again, it's approximately equal. And by the way, while evaluating position, you don't have to dig too deeply trying to really calculate the amount of weak squares both players have or something like that. We evaluated approximately. Therefore, if you aren't sure whose pawn structure is better, it probably means that it's about equal. Alright, and the final factor is the king safety, and here both kings are safe, there is no danger for either of them, therefore we can say that it's equal as well. All in all, we can conclude that all four factors are about equal for both players, and therefore the position is about equal. And indeed, white played here bishop a5, attacking the rook, black relocated it back to c6, white put the bishop back to c3, and after this repetition they actually agreed for a draw, so none of them could find a way to make any progress here, and the position was equal. This position is from the game between Carlsen playing white against Fedoseev playing black. It is white to move. And before we dive into this, let me also make a quick announcement that we are gonna open up enrollment for our flagship course, the Grandmaster's Positional Understanding, and you can click the link below the video and join the waitlist so that as soon as the enrollment is available, you will be notified and you will make a decision of whether or not you want to join the next cohort of students. If you ever find yourself confused in the middle game or after the opening, if you aren't sure why a certain move is better than the other one, if you want to have a step-by-step guide for playing throughout the game of chess, then this course is right for you. There are so many students who benefited from this course already, and you may give it a shot as well once the enrollment is available. So again, you can join the waitlist for now. Alright, now coming back to this example, we can go through the four factors that we know. And by the way, closer to the end of this video, I'll share with you, as I promised, the simplified version of evaluation, where you can spend just a few seconds evaluating a position. But now, once again, let's just do it step by step so that you can clearly understand the entire system, okay? So, first of all, the material balance. Here we can see that white has a rook against bishop and a pawn. And this is a material advantage for white, approximately equal 1 pawn, because the rook is worth a bishop and 2 pawns approximately. So here it's an edge for white. If we're talking about the activity of the pieces, then here this rook on f2 is doing a fairly good job because it's open along this f-file, it's controlling this f-file. So this rook is okay, even though it's not doing too much, because everything is already covered there. The rook on d1 is completely passive, it's just protecting this pawn on d4. The bishop on f1 has nothing to do, it's completely restricted by the black's pawns, it can't really go out anywhere, can't do anything. The king on g1 is also stuck here. In an endgame, you want your king to be closer to the center of the board, so most of the white's pieces are passive. Now let's take a look at black's pieces. The rook here is extremely active along the a-file, it can go inside, go in rook a2, and it will potentially create a lot of problems for white. The knight on e6 is a great knight, it's putting pressure onto this pawn, it's also blockading the white's pawn from e5, therefore it's a great piece. The king in the center of the board is great for an endgame, it's also better than the white's king. The bishop here on b7 is not doing much, so yeah, it's not the best piece of black, but aside of that, the black's position is extremely active, so here it's a clear edge for black. Talking about the king safety, both kings are safe. Usually in an endgame you cannot really attack an opponent's king. And talking about the pawn structure, the final factor, we can see that black has these advanced pawns over here, which are ready to go forward anytime, and it's a really big problem for white. The white's pawn on d4 here, on the other hand, is weak. The knight from here is putting pressure onto this pawn, and white has to constantly guard it. Overall, black's pawns are more advanced, so here once again it's a clear edge for black. Summarizing all the factors, white is ahead in material and black has better pawn structure as well as piece activity. Therefore, it is 2-1. Black is ahead in 2 factors, white is ahead in just 1. Therefore, black is better, but white is still fighting. It's not an overwhelming advantage for black, therefore white can still try to survive in this game. Later in the game, black won. It's been a long game, I will not show it all. As always, I have all the show notes, so to say, in the description below the video, so you can download the games there if you want to see the continuation of this game. And now let's move on to the next example. This position is from the game between Carlsen playing white against Nepomniachtchi playing black. It's white to move. Oh, I'm sorry, it's black to move actually, but it doesn't really matter. Now, let's evaluate this position in a more advanced way. I've told you that there is also a simpler way how grandmasters often evaluate positions in their blitz games and even in their long games, where it's very, very intuitive, very quick, very simple, and let's talk about this. So, even though normally there are 4 factors, but 2 of them has the greatest importance, which is material as well as activity of your pieces. And you can just evaluate basically these 2 and forget about the rest 2, because usually that gives you precise evaluation anyway. And the good thing about the first factor, the material balance, is that it's quite static. It usually does not change from one move to the other, and therefore you don't even have to think about it every time, right? You can already know what a material balance is. For example, in this case, the material balance is equal, position is more or less symmetric, and that's how you begin a chess game. The material balance is equal, and again, it's likely to stay that way for quite a number of moves. Therefore, it comes down to basically just comparing activity of your pieces, and just evaluating this single factor alone already gives you a fairly precise evaluation of the position. And while evaluating activity of your pieces and as well as opponent's pieces, you don't have to really, again, go too much in depth and try to compare, all right, here's my knight, here's his knight, whose knight is better. You don't have to do it like that so methodically. You can just have the overall picture of the position, like who's more advanced, who's controlling more squares on the board, who's more active, who's creating threats, and just thinking in those terms give you an intuitive evaluation of who's better, which you can just, assess within a second probably. Like looking at this position, for example, we can see that again it's quite symmetric, but white's controlling here an open file. The white's queen can possibly go forward there, either to c7 going into black's territory, or maybe to c6 going after this pawn, and therefore it gives white an edge. That's it. So within your head, you can do this just within 1 second, and you can already see that white is better. Now, why is that so? Why is it that we can a little bit forget about the king safety as well as the pawn structure? Well, it's because pieces are just a lot more powerful than pawns, and therefore if your pieces are stronger than your opponent's pieces, then usually you don't have to worry about your king safety. It will be saved by default, just because your pieces are guarding it so well. Same thing with the pawn structure. The pawn structure is usually not a problem if your pieces are extremely active. But in this case, for example, this pawn on a6 is kind of weak, but not just by itself, but because the black's pieces here are doing nothing. They're stuck on their, on passive positions, and therefore white indeed can go queen c6 and start attacking this. So it's not really the pawn itself, it's rather that the black's pieces are not centralized, not active, which causes the problem to the pawn. That's why, again, the piece activity is a dominant factor, and that's why evaluating it alone often is just enough to evaluate the entire position. So that's the pro approach. That's how you can do this within a second. And here is a puzzle of the day. It is black to move, and it is checkmate in 1. Just to make it clear, well, the white side is here. I just didn't flip the board, but you can see that it is black to play, right? So you solve it for black, not for white. Even though it's checkmate in 1, funnily enough, quite often the students could not solve it properly, even fairly advanced students. Therefore, let's see if you can, and if you can, write it down in the comments below. Let's see if you can get this. Now, don't forget to join the waitlist so that as soon as we open up enrollment for the next cohort of students for our flagship course, the Grandmaster's Positional Understanding, you'll be notified. Also, if you want to know the 2 main strategies for finding the right move in any position, then you may check out my video about that. I'll link it in the card as well as in the description below the video. I wish you great chess games, enjoy the game, keep crushing it, and we'll talk to you in the next video.